Worship the Mayor, Hamilton Green, special invitees, fellow engineers, and their guests. It is my pleasant task to introduce our guest speaker for tonight, who is Engineer Philip Allsopp. Philip Allsopp attended Queen's College, which he left in 1945. He then joined the Public Works Department as an apprentice engineer. While there, he passed parts 1 and 2 of the examinations of the Institution of Civil Engineers of the UK, and therefore became eligible for appointment as an engineer in the Public Works Department. However, Engineer Allsopp was awarded a scholarship which enabled him to attend the Imperial College of Science and Technology, University of London, United Kingdom, from 1949 to 1954. There he acquired a Bachelor of Science honors degree in engineering, the Master of Science degree in highway engineering, and the Diploma of Imperial College in Engineering. Engineer Allsopp then returned to British Guyana in 1954 and rejoined the Public Works Department as engineer for the East Bank Demerara Road. There he introduced methods of soil stabilization for the construction of base courses on the reconstruction of stretches of the East Bank Demerara Road. For this pioneering work, he is regarded as the father of soil stabilization in Guyana. From 1955 to 1957, Engineer Allsopp was district engineer at Essequibo, and from 1957 to 1965, he was executive engineer, roads in the first Public Works Department, later the Ministry of Works and Hydraulics. He is responsible for the setting up of the first materials laboratory and for the training of personnel to staff the laboratory. To be appointed the executive engineer in those days, Engineer Allsopp had to pass part 3 of the Institution of Civil Engineers examination. Subsequent appointments held by Engineer Allsopp were Chief Engineer Roads, Ministry of Works from 1965 to 1969, Deputy Chief Works and Hydraulics Officer 1969 to 1971, Chief Works and Hydraulics Officer 1971 to 1973, Technical Specialist, Ministry of Economic Development from 1973 to 1978. In 1978, Engineer Allsopp retired from the public service and became partner of C.A. Liebert and Associates Consulting Engineers and Planners. He left the firm in 1988 to become Guyana's Deputy High Commissioner in London. In 1990, he moved to Brasilia and became Guyana's ambassador to Brazil. He left the diplomatic service in 1993. In 1993. From 1996 to the present, he has worked as a consultant with various consulting firms and also as an independent consulting engineer. It is to be noticed that Engineer Allsopp has demonstrated management capabilities and leadership in a field outside of engineering. One of the things I heard from a former permanent secretary in my young engineer days was that engineers are to be kept on top, but not on top. Engineer Allsopp has shown that he is capable of rising to the top. Engineer Allsopp was awarded the Golden Arrow Achievement for Engineer Services in Guyana on the Order of Rio Branco by the government of Brazil for distinction in diplomatic activity. He was also honorary consul for Italy in Guyana from 1978 to 1988, for which he received the Order of Merit of the Republic of Italy. That is a summary of the career of Engineer Allsopp, but I would like to add some personal experiences which are relevant to this occasion. I first met Engineer Allsopp, I believe, in 1957, at a very critical point in my own personal life. I had just completed a degree in mathematics and physics at the University College of West Indies and was offered a scholarship by the government of then British Guyana to study civil engineering. And this was a dilemma for me because I had a choice of either continuing postgraduate studies in physics or choosing to switch to civil engineering and in effect contracting myself to work in British Guyana. One of my physics lecturers at Mona, when he heard that I was thinking of choosing the civil engineering option, wondered why I wanted to do that, because in his view, all civil engineers did was to draw things. I guess research physics was probably a more important human activity for him. I came back to Guyana because in making the choice I had to also enter into a contract. And I was a bit discouraged by talking to some practicing engineers who suggested that if I were to take the civil engineering option, I would find myself stagnated because they considered that that was what happened to most people in British Guyana. But I met Engineer Allsopp, who actually had a different view. And it was who encouraged me to pursue the civil engineering option. I didn't realize at the time that what he was inviting me to do was to join him in the long slog of developing Guyana. But so it was, and I accepted the scholarship and proceeded to study civil engineering in the UK. And when I came back, I had another eventful meeting with him because having developed an interest in fluid mechanics at the university in UK, I found myself allocated to the roads division when I came back instead of the drainage and irrigation department. And when I complained to Philip, he said, well, try it out for a year and maybe next year there'll be a vacancy in the drainage and irrigation department, you can apply for transfer. But meantime, we have a little project we would like you to do. So I said, what is that? He says, we have to build a new bridge across the Barry River, and we think you're a suitable person for it. Since you like fluid mechanics, you'll be happy that you'll be near water. So off I went to help in the construction of the Barry Bridge, and that has led me to be hooked on bridges since then. So I had to forget my fluid mechanic love. The other part where careers intersected with great significance to me was when he was technical specialist at the Ministry of Economic Development. I got a call from him one day, and when I went to meet him, he said that the government was thinking of building a hydropower project, and that would entail building a road to it, which subsequently turned out to be the famous Upper Mazarine Road project, and that the government was wanted to purchase all the aquapanel components for all the bridges on that project. So I got an early introduction, even before the chief engineer of roads at the time knew about the project. I think he was a little bit upset to know that I had been invited before he could discuss this project. But that led to my association with aquapanel bridge technology, and subsequently, as you know, that to that set of bridges was added the Harbor Bridge, the board of the Guyana Bridge Engineering Project. Philip also led the team, actually a team comprising myself and an attorney from the Attorney General's Chambers, which went and did the final negotiations for the Guyana Bridge, which led to the signing of the contract and the construction of the bridge. So those are three critical points in my life where Philip had a key role to play. And overall, although I may not have chosen the path I took if Philip had not been involved, I'm happy to say that I am not unhappy with the choices followed. And in a sense, I would like to publicly thank Philip for helping me to make those choices at the time.
Mr. Master of Ceremonies, Honorable Prime Minister, members of the Diplomatic Corps, Your Worship, the Mayor of Georgetown, engineers and friends. First of all, I must thank Joe Holder, Engineer Joe Holder, for his very flattering introduction. And he has assisted me really because, having outlined briefly the skeleton of my career, it saves me from going into too much detail. But there is an untold history, I might even say a forgotten history, of engineering events which in some ways have caused the development of our country and in some ways have shaped or retarded such development. Now, absence of history is not a good thing because it means in engineering terms that the reservoir of experience has been depleted. And engineers in Guyana have not really written enough to enable us to assess the quality of the path which we have taken in our development. And some things have not always been too good. But I have decided that the time is appropriate, that I should recount some of those incidents which have, to a certain extent, improved my thinking and my vision of not only the engineering world, but of life in Guyana. You see, an engineer in almost any department of his experience always works in a group of compatible skills. And together with his colleagues, the surveyors, the architects, the mechanics, and other technicians, in that particular sphere of technology, they represent the most ample command of the industry and material resources of mankind. But as the world is divided into nation states who control the laws and the behavioral patterns of man, he has to conform to their demands, and when he does so efficiently, he is the great stabilization in the society. If, on the other hand, he doesn't, things cannot go too well. So he is responsible to a certain extent for the feel-good factor, as we call it, if he does well, and to the feel-bad factor if he doesn't do well, and to the fed-up factor if he does nothing at all. So that in the course of my career, at least that is how it appeared to be when I joined the Public Works Department on the 1st of December 1945. That day has always been a holiday for me, as my wife can tell you, but I regret to admit that I worked yesterday. And that was partly due to the fact that the telephone was ringing incessantly from people seeking advice as to whether or not they should lift their furniture off the floor. When I joined the PWD in 1945, the Director of Public Works, these were colonial days, the Director of Public Works was the supreme commander. We did not have the ministerial system, and when that was introduced, eventually, I served under several ministers, beginning with Rudy Kendall, Boise Ramkaran, Mohammed Qasim, Field and Singh, Hamilton Green, and Desmond Hoyt. Of those ministers, former ministers, only one of them is alive today. Now, when I joined the Public Works Department, the Deputy Director, Mr. Rupert Craig, was responsible for my training. He was a chartered engineer, a Guyanese engineer. In fact, he was the first qualified Guyanese engineer. And when he thought that I had become sufficiently mature, he put me on my first assignment, and I tell you about this because it was very significant and had a great effect on my thinking in engineering. When he thought that I had seen enough of going office and a bit of field work, he posted me as the clerk of works at the Sparendam police station, which was being built at the time, a new station. And I was responsible to the district engineer, who put me, a young man, over the overseer and the contractor, and gave me authority to see the job completed. Straight away, I found massive corruption, collusion, fraud, and I was quite dismayed. This is the sort of thing I would have to deal with. However, I stood firm and decided to, as they say, take arms against a sea of troubles. The overseer was dismissed, but the story doesn't end there. When he received his letter of dismissal, I happened to be perched on top of the roof at Sparendam, and he proceeded to remove the ladder. And then he repaired to the district engineer's office and found this fellow had the physique of a gladiator. So he picked up the district engineer and attempted to throw him through the window. That was my understanding of the human factor in engineering. However, I did not feel very comfortable. And one thing that I recall from that early experience is a resolve to try and do something about road construction, because I had to ride from Sparendam every day on 2 concrete strips with burnt earth in between. In the rainy season it was slippery, in the dry season it was dusty and hazardous. And I decided that I would like to do something about that, but in a general sort of a way. Now, when I left Queen's College in July 1945, my thought was to study civil engineering, and I really wished to go straight to university. But that was not to be because I couldn't afford it. And that's why I went into the apprenticeship, which jobs were really reserved, I should say, for the sons of expatriates. When the war was finished, times had changed, and there were vacancies. So that's how I got into the Public Works Department. And I was fortunate to have qualified for an engineering scholarship. They were awarding a few engineering scholarships at that time in celebration of the Allied victory, and they called them victory scholarships. I got one, and I decided from all that I had read and understood that the best place for me was to try to get into the Imperial College of Science and Technology, and that is what I requested. Now, when I got there, I must admit that I felt very daunted, because I then remembered that that was the college. It had an elitist reputation, but that was the college where the first Guyanese who wished to study engineering, E.M. Duke, Edgar Mortimer Duke, that is where he went after having won the Guyana scholarship at the age of 15. He was supposed to be an outstanding mathematician, and he was accepted at the Imperial College. It was then known as the City and Guilds Engineering College. But he did very well. I think they were expecting that he would not. He did very well, but at the end of his first year, he was called by his professor and advised that he would, although he would qualify as a civil engineer, he was unlikely to find employment as an engineer in colonial British Guyana. It was not the policy. Perhaps it was the feeling that colonial peoples at that time did not have the mental acuity to handle complex engineering projects. So poor Duke was advised, he was advised that perhaps he should think of something else. He accepted the advice, left the college, studied law, eventually became a judge in Guyana, and I think the first Guyanese chancellor of the University of Guyana. One or two other people had gone, the sons of expatriates, but no Guyanese as far as I know. So when I got there, I felt rather daunted, and I was determined that I should do the best I could. The situation was very good. They had an excellent course for students, and I found, to my great delight, that I was awarded at the end of my bachelor's degree. I desired to go on to do research in highway engineering, because they only awarded a master's degree in those days by research. You could not take a standard examination for it. And when I started my graduate course and was on the way, I was assisted by the award of the Unwin Scholarship in Civil Engineering. I mention this because Professor Unwin it was who had advised Duke to leave. He died in the 1930s, left a legacy to be given to a student who, in the view of the staff, had done most towards improving the academic and extracurricular activity of the college. And I was very much flattered indeed to have been awarded the Unwin Scholarship. And I had the privilege, in addition to that, and I must mention this, forgive me because this is my swan song, I was elected president of the Students' Union. So I proceeded to do my research on the very distinguished people. And the real significance is that Rupert Craig, who was still, I think by then he had become Director of Public Works, I asked him to send me a large quantity of clay from Guyana. And he sent me 700 weight of coastal clay from Guyana to enable me to do my research at Imperial College. And I did that under some very distinguished people. To name one of them, the late Professor Sir Alec Skempton, the same person who was responsible largely for the rehabilitation of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. He was a distinguished geotechnical engineer, and I had the honor of working under him. Now, the result of that is that when I came back to Guyana, I was able to establish the first materials laboratory in the country. And we started to do our research in materials, in foundation engineering, and then many things were done as a result of the laboratory work. technicians were trained. 2 of them eventually became consulting engineers, one in Trinidad and one of them is still here. And a number of technicians went on to do some work here. That was a very satisfying experience because I tell you, it had effects on things like sea defenses, because we did not understand in those days exactly what was happening to sea defense construction, to sea defenses in Guyana, how they failed. And the subject of soil mechanics had only recently been, I wouldn't say discovered, practiced. And one of the things I learned at the college was the behavior of clay soils, the concept of slipping, the slip circle, and I was able to explain to the local field exactly what happens when a sea defense dam fails. Because it failed by slipping, it was immediately destroyed by the waves, and therefore it was difficult to recognize exactly how it had failed. So that happened in the early 1950s, and it has of course been proven by further experiments in science today. So that my stay at the Imperial College was extremely profitable, and to this day I still look back at some of my notes. So I was off to a good start as a civil engineer, I thought, and I was the first Guyanese to have done postgraduate to postgraduate degree in engineering. Many others have done it since and have in fact surpassed me. What I can do is to give you a sketch and fill in the gaps that Joe Holder may have left. I am not going to give you a start to finish description. What I can do is simply to highlight some of the things which I consider to have been of significance in the course of my career. And I would like to continue on this matter of the experiments with clay because it was effective when I was actually put in charge of the East Bank Road. In fact, when I came back, I was shown the Quarantine Road, which had failed very badly, and I was able to swear to myself that I would try to eliminate the use of burnt earth in this country, because the Quarantine Road failed largely because it was built on with burnt earth as a base, and it was improperly done. So I was inspired into doing further experiments with a mixture of sand and clay and soil stabilization, which, although not practiced in the way which I consider to be important, nevertheless has had its mark up to now in Guyana. Another thing which I would remember as being significant in this whole field of foundation engineering is the construction of the Demerara sugar terminals. Although this was not a government project, the Demerara sugar terminals, with this one down here, was built on a floating foundation which became world famous really in this technique. And the man who was doing the design happened to have been a colleague of mine at the Imperial College. And when he came down and he saw me here, he didn't know where I was. He invited me to participate in the soil testing procedures. And ultimately in my career, I happened to be asked to do the inspection of the foundations, which was one of the most frightening things that I've done in Guyana. Because after about 5 years, they wanted to find out whether their theory was correct, whether their technique was correct. And therefore, I had a consultancy to go into the foundations below ground and examine something like 50 cells on the ground, which had not been touched in 5 years. And I had to crawl through them, just as Theseus crawled through the labyrinth, holding a cord, because when you passed from one cell to another, you were totally disoriented, and you couldn't tell where you were. And this was one of the most frightening things I've done. And when I came out, I was told that I looked different and I smelled different. So that was one of the reactions from my laboratory experience. We also established an asphalt laboratory, which no longer exists. And we were able to do work which materially affected our road construction because we didn't know enough about asphalt in those days. Now, when I chose the title Around Guyana in 60 Years, I didn't mean to infer that I spent all of my time in Guyana, because this was not the case. And I am particularly grateful for two international organizations which have been of considerable assistance to me. I refer to the USAID, United States Agency for International Development, and UNDP, United Nations Development Program. Because through USAID, I was able to gain attachments to state highway departments in the United States. I worked in those departments and had free access to almost every part of them. And I worked in over a period of about 2 years in 2 different sessions. I worked in 7 state highway departments. And I gained a tremendous amount from them. In fact, I learned most of my highway engineering there. And to supplement that, they sent a man whom I will always remember, James Cheatham, a retired highway engineer from the Bureau of Public Roads, to Guyana. He was not particularly welcome in colonial Guyana, but then he got along, he contacted me, and both of us worked together, worked very well, and were able to do some innovative things. So this is an opportunity for me to thank James Cheatham, who is now dead, I am afraid. But one of the things that came out of the USAID program was my attachment to the well-known Test Road in Ottawa, Illinois, where the Americans were experimenting on the best ways to design a highway on the different conditions. It was being conducted by the AASHTO, or American Association of State Highway Officials. And there I was attached to a famous man, Arthur Benkelman, he who developed the Benkelman knee beam, which highway engineers with which they are familiar. And Benkelman told me when he was developing his beam, he said, never let anyone sell you this bit of equipment because you can make it yourself. And he gave me the drawings. But of course, there's such a thing as patent law, and I was never able to take his advice. But what happened was that I learned the American techniques of pavement design before they were revealed to the rest of the world. I worked there in 1959, 1960, and the publications releasing the results were made, I think it's 1972. And the results, or the methods which I learned, were applied here on the reconstruction of the road between Mahaica and Rosignol, which we did ourselves in the road division. They were also applied on the Linden Highway, and I would like to make the statement now that the Linden Highway, our best highway in Guyana, was designed by the Roads Division of the Ministry of Works. It was built by the Americans. They reviewed our design, but we had the capability to design according to the methodology which was introduced here. We designed it ourselves. And the same method was used in the design of other roads. The Mabura Road, which I did myself, and Mandela Avenue, and bank when they were rebuilding the seawall, because we argued that we needed to have an alternative route. They allowed us to design and build it, and we used the same stabilized method for the base, and as you can see, it is still functional today. Under the UNDP, I felt that I needed some exposure to management and planning of highway systems. And UNDP gave me a fellowship which took me right around the world, really. I started off in Sweden, where in 1967 they had changed their traffic over from left to right. And I thought that the same thing was likely to happen in Guyana, because we were thinking even then about connecting with Brazil. So I went to Sweden to see how they did it. And I was much impressed. When I came back home and I wrote a report, the cabinet of the day said, yes, go ahead, change the traffic over, but then they provided no money. Therefore, nothing was done. That's the story of the right-hand traffic. I think that they may reconsider it again. But I also worked in Kenya, in Thailand, at the Road Research Laboratory in Britain at Harmansworth, and then I went back to the United States, where I had a stint in the state of New Mexico. So that between USAID and UNDP, I gained, in my view, a tremendous amount of knowledge in the administration, design, and planning of highways. Now I come to a stage that lots of my friends have been asking me to deal with, and it is the story of the Del Conte Road. Because many of you here tonight are too young to know the truth of the Del Conte Road. Now what I'm going to tell you is not hearsay, because I myself was involved. I was on leave, and I was recalled from leave in order to handle a particular situation. I was recalled and put to act as Deputy Director of Public Works. And what happened was that the director had promptly taken leave, and the person who was Chief Engineer Roads was then acting as director, and he called me back and put it in my lap and said, "Now, here is a problem which you have to face." And what had happened was that Alcide Del Conte, who was a very charming man, he had successfully persuaded the government, without reference to the engineering department, to build this road from Parika to Macaria. It was a good project, theoretically, but he proposed to design it and to finance it, so the government would not really have to put in much money. The financing included an advance, which he would cover by the equipment which he would bring in, so that was his collateral, and the rest of the money would be paid by bonds. Government took out bonds with a bonding company. And then when the engineers were shown this and said, "Look, examine it and tell us what to do," the thing was almost a fait accompli. When we looked at it, we found that it was very badly designed. It just would not work. And he said, "Oh, I would make that good. It would be all right." So we didn't think it would be all right, but we were heavily committed. He went ahead and failed, of course. But the tragedy of the thing was that bonds had already been committed, and the financial secretary advised that we could not renege on the bonds because we would lose our international reputation. And consequently, the contract was not exactly terminated. He just simply stopped working, went away, and we had to pay to fulfill the purchase of those bonds. So it was a tremendous loss. And that, in a nutshell, was the story of the Del Conte Road. But it was a good project, which, if properly handled, would have been in good condition today. just about that time, or a bit later on, there were a number of things which occurred. And again, this is a sketch, so I can just give it to you in quiet stages. I did a fair amount of traveling, and I went with my minister at the time to a conference in Peru where they were planning a route across the Andes from the east to the west. And when I saw what was happening, it occurred to me that if we could connect up with Latin, we would be able to drive from Georgetown right through South America, cross the Andes in Peru, and get onto the Pan American Highway, and go all the way up to Alaska, and back around Canada, and come back to Guyana through Venezuela. And I thought that that would be the longest drive in the world. I very indiscreetly mentioned this to an American consultant who was passing through. We were planning to see how we could get finance to do it privately. The next thing I knew was that it was published in an American magazine as his idea, and that he was planning to do it. So we partly dropped the project, especially as the Pan American Highway still had a gap in it. And that was one of my disappointments, because I was hoping to be able to do that. Now, just about that time too, I think there was the case of what I like to call the New River adventure. You all know that the New River was, there was a mini invasion by the Surinamese, and they built an airstrip and occupied it. And at the time, I remember thinking that while we were rejoicing that we had thrown them out, if the rains came and the airstrip became soft, you would not be able to reinforce the garrison. I mean, this was my simple thinking as an engineer. And I mentioned to my minister at the time that this was a bit tricky and that something should be done to improve the airstrip. But he picked it up immediately. I spoke to him in the morning, and in the afternoon he came back to me and said, "You are going to the New River now. You don't have to take anything. Captain Roberts will receive you and give you whatever you wanted. You are to say this to nobody except your wife. And you're leaving now." So off I went, and there I found a surveyor, Albert Sweetman, who was getting up some materials, and we worked together, and of course the rains came. And I didn't know when I would get out. Oh, I got a message saying, "Oh, you will tell us when you can come out." It meant that the plane had to land and pick me up and take me back, which eventually happened. But I always remember that, and the minister who gave that order eventually became mayor of Georgetown. I wouldn't say too much more about airstrips. I really love them, you know. And I had a lot of adventures with them. I was in the first group that went to find Gun Strip when it was handed over to the Guyana government by the American Army after the war. Gun Strip was a secret airstrip built in the southern part of Guyana. It was incorrectly placed on the map, and when it was handed over to us, we had to go in and find it. It was not easy to do. We very nearly ran out of fuel, but we found it one Sunday morning. So that was an adventure. I was, at the time, the inspector or the technical advisor on airstrip development, and I had some rather exciting experiences. One of them was in going to the Keriku airstrip. We had to cross the Sakaika River, having landed in the river with an amphibious plane. We had to cross the Sakaika Falls, were just about a mile downstream, and of course, the battle foundered and went down. And I had this frightening sensation in my head and in my stomach that if I didn't get to that coast, I would go over the Sakaika Falls. But I managed to reach the coast, and I'm still here today. The post of Chief Works and Hydraulics Officer, they changed from Deputy Director to Chief Works and Hydraulics Officer. And I occupied that position for 2 or 3 years. In fact, I was the last person to hold that post because after I left it, they divided it into 2. And you had works and hydraulics. But while I was there, I remember with some gratification what appeared to be the first introduction of women into engineering in Guyana. The government of the day apparently received an application from some young ladies from one of the leading secondary schools for girls in Georgetown, and I was asked to interview 4 of them to advise whether they were likely to be suitable for the engineering function in Guyana. I was a bit dismayed because I didn't like to think that any of them would have had this Barandan experience that I had. But I interviewed them, and I found that they were, I thought, very suitable. And I'm pleased to say that 2 of them were awarded scholarships, and both of them got first-class honors in engineering, which was not an easy thing to do. And then the following year, a very interesting experience. Another young lady comes along to be interviewed. She must have heard that this fellow asked some very searching questions, and she was ready for me. So when I asked her, what has encouraged you to think of civil engineering? She said, oh sir, when I, in my mathematics, studied the catenary, that is the theoretical operation of the suspension bridge. When I studied the catenary, I fell in love with the suspension bridge. Oh, I said, have you ever seen one? Oh, she said, no, I've never seen one, but I've seen it on the pictures. But then I understand that it vibrates. So I was not taken in. However, she got a scholarship, but she got the scholarship in electrical engineering. So she could not have been all that fascinated by the suspension bridge. She must have been fascinated by an electrical generator. Possibly because of the heat that it emitted. But that was a useful part of my activity because I felt to a certain extent that I was able to introduce the concept of using women in engineering in Guyana. And I didn't have to be as persuasive with them as I was with Joe Holder. I should mention that just about that time, 1974, I think, and this would surprise you, around 1974, the Kanji Bridge was built, or at least was designed, because we learned that the Americans were very partial to the improvement of approaches to cities. And therefore I advised, on the basis of my knowledge, that you should apply for the improvement of approaches to Georgetown and New Amsterdam. In the case of New Amsterdam, obviously, the old Kanji swing bridge would have to be replaced by a proper structure. They bought it immediately, and we got a USA loan to build the Kanji Bridge. And at the same time, the approaches to Georgetown were designed by an American firm, starting from Grove and ending at Mahaica, and that included the 4-lane highway which we are presently building. It was conceived in 1974. Drawings were prepared, but the money wasn't there. And the only part that was built was between Georgetown and Plaisance. But the 4-lane highway was conceived at that time. As far as the Demerara Harbor Bridge is concerned, we had that in mind. But you know what triggered it off? What triggered it off was a direct offer by an American to build a bridge across the Demerara River and have it as a toll bridge. He would collect the tolls for about 10 years. And the advice given to the minister was, look, let us go for the other option of using the Acro Panel Bridge. So I became immediately involved in negotiations for the design of the bridge by Thomas Torrey. That was eventually built in 1978. I should also mention as a historical landmark that it was during my tenure of office as Chief Works and Hydraulics Officer that my minister instigated the development of the Itabu Quarry, which is now called the Mazuri Granite Quarry. But that was a government quarry which was developed into a fine quarry, well equipped, the idea being to undercut the high cost of stone. That was developed just about that time. And when I left the post of Chief Works and Hydraulics Officer, I moved to the Ministry of Economic Development into a position which was recommended by Professor Arthur Lewis, who advised us on our economic development program and thought that the economic development program needed an engineering input, if only to monitor what was going on. And I was the third technical specialist to be appointed to that post. And I was kept very busy. I, among other things, assisted in negotiating the delivery of Tata buses to Guyana and the start of the textile mill by China. I retired in 1978 and went into private practice, where I did a lot of general practitioner work. And I was project engineer administration on the Mahaica-Myconia-Barry Drains and Irrigation Project, which was the prime consultants was William Holco and partner. I was project engineer administration, and subsequently, when that part of it was finished, the Brazilian firm came in, Geotechnica, and I was also project engineer administration under them in the completion of the MMA ADA project. It was at that stage that I was commissioned to design and supervise the construction of the road to Babura Hill, which I did and patterned in a way after the design of the Linden Highway. But I must tell you that if you think that the life of an engineer is without thrills, this story would serve to satisfy your curiosity. I was in private practice I was a partner in the firm of Libbert and Associates. I was also honorary consul for Italy, and the idea was put to me by the Italians that we could use Guyana granite to slice and make it into stones, slabs of granite, which you can use to face buildings. It was supposed to be a very lucrative idea. And so, as the honorary consul, I arranged for a large chunk of granite to be sent to Italy for testing. The report was positive, and there it is. I envisaged Guyana having great industry, exporting granite slabs to the United States and other places. I envisaged places like the Bank of Guyana covered in this granite slab. And I went to Italy to see exactly what was happening, and I was told by the man who was proposing it, yes, the granite is excellent, we can do it, because the technology really was not very advanced. But I don't think I want to have anything more to do with it, because the mafia have become interested and jealous. I thought this was a rather lame excuse, and I shut it out of my mind for a moment, but that same night, my wife and I were having dinner in the Piazza Navona in Rome. And along came a young man, a rather athletic-looking fellow with piercing eyes, came up to our table and said, "Oh, you're visitors here, I can see that. I hope you have a very nice stay in Rome, and there are lots of things to do. I'd like to leave you this gift." And he left a pen for me and a similar pen for my wife, and then he disappeared. And when I picked up the pen, it was inscribed in very ornate letters with the compliments of the Godfather. That was the end of the grand. And I think some enterprising businessmen among you may wish to take it up from there. I should also mention that I was the first team leader for the Guyana-Suriname ferry project. And the Guyana-Suriname ferry project had its origin in a political debate. And I was told, because I wasn't present, I was told that coming out of the argument between President Burnham and the Prime Minister of Suriname in Barbados, it was agreed that in order to cool the heat, Guyana and Suriname should do something together. The Guyana-Suriname ferry project emerged out of that. And my firm won the consultancy to do the design. We were in association with 2 English firms, and we started the project, and I was the team leader, which made me feel very proud. But what happened was that there was this coup in Suriname, which ended the first project, and it was picked up again by another consultant, but it was I who started it as team leader. And now a few words about the diplomatic service. And I say this because when I was invited to join the diplomatic service, a number of my colleagues criticized me and said that, you know, an engineer shouldn't be dabbling in that sort of thing. You have work to do as an engineer, why accept this? But the story was simple. The president at the time, President Hoyt, told me that he was much impressed after a visit to India with how Indira Gandhi handled her diplomats and the sort of semi-technical work they did in getting aid and trade. And he felt he wanted to do the same thing with our diplomatic service, and he thought, in view of the many discussions we had together when he was the Minister of Economic Development, that I should at least try it out. And so I accepted the appointment, and I must say that I enjoyed it. But it was not entirely without engineering input. Because at the 1989 Commonwealth Heads of Government Conference in Kuala Lumpur, the Iwakrama project was launched. And I took part in the discussion, and I'm pleased to say that after it was approved and we went back to London, and I was a member of the initial committee getting up the possible structure of the investigating team. They said, but we don't know Guyana, and I was the only person who had some proper knowledge at the time in London, and I put a mark on the map and said, I think this is where it should be. And to my great surprise and delight, that was accepted. And where you see Iwakrama now is where I had suggested that it should be. So that was an engineering input into the diplomatic service. And furthermore, when I was in Brazil, and we were trying to get the road from Latham to Georgetown, I was the head of the negotiating team in the final days in '92. with Banco do Brazil and the Brazilian government, and in fact the loan did come through. It came through in October, shortly before the change of government. But we were told that the IMF considered that it was not sufficiently concessionary, and therefore it was not accepted. But I considered my stay in the diplomatic service as being a sabbatical in engineering, and I was always on the lookout for engineering solutions, engineering inputs. So I did not give up the practice of engineering while I was a diplomat. Some of my diplomatic friends might shrug it off and say, that should not have been, you should have been 100% a diplomat. But I enjoyed it nevertheless, and I came back home, became an independent consultant, and worked on things like the Farm Access Road, some sea defense projects, and ultimately the National Development Strategy, where Joe Holder and I worked on the transportation sector. I was the chairman and he was my first assistant really, and we prepared the transportation sector of the National Development Strategy. And then of course finally in my private practice you would have heard of my involvement in the cricket stadium, preparation of the bid, and in the task force for infrastructure development when we had the floods in the early part of this year. And I trust that that is not going to be repeated. But I have given you a sketch. I have omitted certain things. I have omitted, and perhaps I should tell you, because people have asked me this, the National Cultural Center, which was built in 1972 for Carifesta. Why is this great big column in the middle? Why don't we have a clear span? They're right. The president of the day wanted a clear span. Everything was being done in such a hurry that the consultant made a mistake, an error of judgment, and we found that we could not build a clear span unless we reinforced the foundations and the piles had already been driven. And therefore a decision had to be taken, and the president of the day said, I will not have it. I must have a clear span. And therefore I went home and I had a semi-sleepless night, and I decided, no, you couldn't have a clear span because I'm not sure that it would be safe. It was a marginal case. So I said, we will put not one, but 4 columns, decorate them and make them look good so that it is not going to look too ugly. So when you go to the cultural center and you see what's happening in the middle, you would know the story, that it was intended to be a clear span, but because of the haste with which it was done, and everybody pushing to get it finished in time, there was an error of judgment which resulted in the presence of those columns. Now, having given you a sketch, I think it is only right that I should say something about the future that I put nationally and internationally. You have only to look at our needs in energy, transportation, drainage, flood control, irrigation, and the nature of the facilities required for the normal conduct of everyday life, to understand that if the privations of our living conditions are to be eliminated, then the basic improvements must be in the fields of energy and information technology. For these are required to improving health, education, and production. Every time we complete a study in any aspect of infrastructure requirements, the question always remains, how will we develop the skills required to execute the plans and maintain the finished product? When we consider the steady outflow of technical services from the university and the departments of government and from the private sector, we would understand that the generated forces for development of our communities are being steadily depleted. We as a body of engineers must consider how we could rekindle some vitality in the engineering profession and how best to organize ourselves to achieve this. And here I would pause and tell you that once when I was in China on the Guyana delegation, I had the privilege of meeting with the Chinese Prime Minister Chou En-lai, who when he looked at the list of delegates and he saw that there was an engineer, he asked to see me. And one of the things he told me was this. He said, you have a duty to teach your people to maintain whatever they have. He began by telling me he thought I was too young for the job, mind you. He said, you have a duty to teach them to maintain, because if when they learn to maintain, they develop the skill to build. And it is only when you build for yourself that you develop the ability to innovate. And he said, China has thrived on innovation. All of this came through the interpreter. I've never forgotten that, because over the years I've come to realize that he's right, and that our maintenance generally is substandard. And if our maintenance remains substandard, we are not going to be great innovators. And I would also like to tell you this. We must study the implications of globalization in Guyana's economy. The Caribbean single market and economy would siphon off our skills if some formula is not found to retain them. And if you think that we are unique in this respect, let me give you an example of the apprehensions of one of the powerful G8 countries, the United Kingdom. I was in London a couple of months ago, and this is what it is reported that the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown, said in a recent address to the Trade Union Council in Britain. At no point in our whole history has the speed and scale of technological change been so fast and pervasive. China and India are now turning out more engineers, more computer scientists, more university graduates, 4 million a year, more than the whole of Europe and America combined. And so the answer lies not in protectionism, hoping that Asia will go away, but in radically upgrading our skills, science and technology. For me, nothing in the next year is more important than preparing and equipping our nation for meeting and mastering these global changes, so that we can, instead of being the victims of globalization, be its beneficiaries. The Guyana Association of Professional Engineers and government should enter into discussion on how a more skilled, more adaptable, and more enterprising Guyana can make the right long-term decisions in order to succeed in the next stage of the global economy. But first, the government should recognize who is defined as an engineer with the authority to impose and maintain technical standards. At the moment, we in GAPE know who we are, but not many people can define us. We know who is a professional engineer. We know who is qualified to maintain standards and establish security. But we are not defined as such. We are not registered as such. And it would surprise you to know that anybody can call himself an engineer. And anybody can sign a plan. Registration has been granted to doctors, lawyers, marriage officers, surveyors, but not to engineers or architects. Now that, to my mind, is a grave mistake and should be corrected as soon as possible. Ever so often, a new popular expression arises to catch our attention and incite inquiry. The latest one in the context of engineering is outsourcing. It has interested me because it seems to offer a chance of turning to practical account the movement which we view with suspicion, globalization. As transport costs fall, there is a separation in the geography of production from the geography of consumption. That is to say that goods and services which are required in rich countries where labor costs are high then become much cheaper if provided in countries where labor costs are much lower. China, India, Korea, Mexico, Brazil all supply goods and services to the USA and Europe to the mutual economic advantage of all. But this is only feasible if the supplier has good resources of energy and information technology, that is, engineering. This applies not only to manufactured goods, but white-collar jobs such as human resource services, credit card processing, debt collection, etc. Over the years, we have prepared several development plans, and we have tended to lean heavily on advice from foreign institutions, but these have had one common deficiency, and that is the low priority given to energy development. This is an engineering function which must be improved to a high degree if we are to improve our quality of life, promote industry, and increase job opportunities. Without it, outsourcing becomes impossible. We in GATE have a responsibility to our country. Just as important, we have a responsibility to our family and our fellow men to help to shape the environment of today into a meaningful living place. We must welcome the future, recognizing that soon it will be past. And we must respect the past, for it is that which has given us experience. As I now pause at the end of my 60th year of experience, I have given you a sketch of those incidents which have colored my thinking and in fact improved my education. And for whatever they are worth, although inadequate to my tastes, I now commend them to the candor and curiosity of my colleagues and friends. Thank you.
On behalf of GATE, I'd like to present the small token to Mr. Philip Allsopp.